I've lived beside that little rural airstrip for almost 12 years now, long enough that the sound of small planes coming in low over the trees barely registers in my brain anymore. Most people hear an engine overhead and look up. I hear it and think, yep, probably Carl spraying soybean fields again. That runway was there long before most of us bought homes out there, and honestly, that's part of why I like the place. No HOA breathing down your neck, no traffic, no neighbors stacked 10 feet apart pretending they enjoy each other's company while secretly filing noise complaints over wind chimes. Just open land, quiet evenings, and the occasional Cessna drifting overhead like a lazy bird. My property sat along the western edge of the strip, and because of federal aviation rules, the back corner of my lot had to stay clear. No tall trees, no sheds, no structures, nothing that could interfere with approach clearance. According to standard procedure, those safety corridors are treated almost like invisible extensions of the runway itself, and everyone out there knew it. Or at least I thought they did. Then the new neighbors moved in. Young couple, maybe early 40s, city people trying real hard to cosplay country life. The husband, Derek, not his real name, obviously, had that kind of confidence that instantly makes you tired. You know the type, guy buys one pair of work boots and suddenly thinks he's a land developer. First week after moving in, he's already talking about opening up the view behind our properties like he personally discovered the horizon. At first, I didn't think much of it. New people always come in wanting to upgrade things. Usually that means they build an ugly fire pit and annoy everybody for 6 months before reality settles in. But then one Thursday afternoon, I came home from work and spotted wooden stakes sticking up out near the back field. They were close enough to the runway side that I figured maybe the airstrip maintenance guys were marking drainage or something. Didn't bother me. Next day, more posts appeared. By Saturday morning, there were beams. Sunday evening, there was a full-blown gazebo standing in the middle of my damn property, like it had spawned there overnight. And this thing wasn't small either. We're talking raised platform, thick timber supports, peaked roof, the kind of structure suburban Pinterest addicts build after watching 2 episodes of HGTV and suddenly believing they're frontier architects. I just stood there staring at it for a solid minute because my brain genuinely couldn't process the audacity. The structure wasn't near the property line. It was across it, several feet inside my surveyed boundary. And somehow, as if trespassing wasn't enough, they had managed to place the thing directly inside the protected FAA approach corridor. Like statistically speaking, if you tried to pick the worst possible location, you'd land right there. So that evening, I walked over next door, trying to keep things civil. Big mistake. Derek was sitting on the half-finished gazebo with a beer in his hand, looking proud as hell, like he'd just built the Lincoln Memorial. I said, "Hey man, I think there's been a mistake here. That structure's actually on my land." And he barely even looked concerned. He took a sip of his beer, shrugged, and goes, "Well, it's just empty space back there." Didn't seem like anybody was using it. I remember blinking at him because I honestly thought maybe I misheard him. Empty space. As if property ownership expires if grass grows on it. I explained the survey markers, explained the boundary line, even mentioned the FAA clearance restrictions around the runway. You know what this guy says to me? "Come on, man, it's only a couple feet. Don't be one of those neighbors." That sentence right there told me everything I needed to know. Because people like Derek always frame boundaries as you being unreasonable instead of them being entitled. It's a psychological trap people use when they know they're wrong, but still want social control over the conversation. They act casual, so your legitimate concern sounds emotional by comparison. And standing there listening to this guy explain why my own property line apparently didn't matter anymore. Something in my head just clicked. I stopped arguing immediately. Didn't threaten him. Didn't raise my voice, didn't even mention lawyers. I just nodded and said, "All right." Then I walked back to my house, sat down at my kitchen table, and made one phone call that would erase his little backyard paradise before the week was over. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where people outside the US, and honestly even a lot of Americans, completely misunderstand how these situations work. Folks hear small private airstrip and assume it's basically the Wild West. Like everybody's just doing whatever they want out there. Nope, not even close. From a legal perspective, once an airstrip is federally registered, there are layers of aviation safety rules attached to the surrounding land, especially near approach paths. Those clear zones exist because pilots coming in low don't have much margin for error. Even something as harmless looking as a gazebo can become a hazard if it sits high enough in the wrong location. According to standard procedure, the FAA and local county authorities maintain obstruction charts that map out exactly what can and cannot exist near those flight paths. And trust me, they do not care whether your structure is cute, temporary, or just for relaxing with a glass of wine. A violation is a violation. But honestly, the property issue interested me even more than the aviation side because this kind of conflict happens constantly between neighbors. One person sees and used land and starts mentally reclassifying it as shared space. That's where entitlement starts growing. This is a psychological trap people fall into when they confuse visibility with ownership. If they can see it every day, they slowly convince themselves they somehow deserve access to it. And once somebody publicly builds something on land they don't own, their ego gets attached to it. At that point, removing the structure stops feeling like correcting a mistake. To them, it feels like humiliation. That's why people like Derek usually double down instead of apologizing early when they still have the chance. And unfortunately for him, he picked the absolute worst possible patch of land in the county to test that theory on. The morning after that conversation, I called the regional aviation office and kept the whole thing very simple. I didn't rant, didn't start throwing around dramatic accusations, didn't even mention the argument with Derek. I just told them there appeared to be a newly constructed obstruction inside the registered Western Approach corridor near the airstrip. That was it. And the funny thing about government agencies is, the calmer you sound, the more seriously they tend to take you. People think power comes from yelling. Usually it comes from sounding organized. The woman on the phone asked for the parcel number, runway designation, and approximate location of the structure. I gave her everything, thanked her for her time, and went about my week. Meanwhile, next door, Derek was acting like he'd just opened a lakeside resort. Every evening, he and his wife were out there sitting under that oversized wooden roof, drinking wine and waving at planes like they personally owned the runway. At one point, he even yelled over the fence, "Looks pretty good back there, huh?" I just smiled and said, "Yeah, we'll see how long it lasts." That apparently amused him because he laughed like I was bluffing. And honestly, I think that's the part that fascinated me most. He truly believed consequences only existed if somebody got emotional enough to create them immediately. Since I wasn't screaming or threatening lawsuits, he assumed nothing was happening. That's another psychological trap entitled people fall into. Silence makes them feel safe. 3 days later, around 9 in the morning, a white county SUV rolled slowly down the gravel road beside the runway. I happened to be outside stacking firewood when it pulled up near the backfield. Guy steps out wearing a reflective vest, carrying a clipboard, and one of those laser rangefinder tools surveyors use. Calm demeanor, zero drama. Behind him came another older man from the Airstrip Authority, somebody I'd actually met once before during a drainage inspection years ago. Derek came outside almost immediately because, of course he did. The second he saw officials near his gazebo, his entire body language changed. You could actually watch the confidence drain out of him in real time. He walked over smiling too hard, trying to act casual. "Morning, gentlemen, something going on?" The inspector barely looked at him. "We're investigating a reported obstruction within the protected approach zone." And right there, that word, obstruction, you could see the first crack hit Derek's ego. Because suddenly his little backyard hangout wasn't being discussed like a home improvement project anymore. It was being categorized as a safety problem. The inspector spent maybe 40 minutes out there. He measured distances from the runway centerline, checked elevation grades, referenced some printed approach charts, then used the laser tool to calculate roof height. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The professionalism almost made it more brutal. Derek kept trying to jump into the conversation with comments like, "It's not permanent," or "It's just recreational use." And the inspector responded the same way every time. Short, emotionless answers. That's irrelevant to the clearance requirements. You know you're losing when bureaucrats stop sounding human. At one point I walked out toward the fence just to observe, and Derek immediately started performing for the audience. "Can you believe this?" he said, throwing his arms out dramatically. "All this over a gazebo?" I remember looking at him and thinking, this guy still doesn't get it. He thought the issue was personal revenge because that's how people like him interpret accountability. In his mind, I wasn't protecting property rights or aviation safety. I was being difficult. That mentality is exactly why these conflicts escalate. People who ignore boundaries almost always see enforcement as aggression. About an hour later, the inspector finally closed his clipboard and said the sentence that ended the entire situation. This structure is in violation of both county property records and FAA obstruction clearance standards. Just like that. No debate. No negotiation. From a legal perspective, once those words hit paper, Derek was cooked. The official notice showed up 2 days later taped to his front door. I know because he came storming across my yard holding it in his hand like an angry movie villain. "You called the FAA?" he snapped, not even denying what he did anymore, which I found interesting. I said, "You built a structure inside a federally protected flight path on somebody else's land. Who exactly did you think was going to handle it?" He started ranting immediately, pacing around, talking about how the county was overreacting, how nobody had ever complained before, how the gazebo wasn't hurting anybody. Then came my favorite line of the whole situation. He actually said, "Do you have any idea how much money I spent on that thing?" And man, the temptation to laugh directly in his face was overwhelming. Because yes, Derek, I imagine illegally building a large wooden structure tends to get expensive, especially the removal part. The notice gave him a very short timeline to dismantle the gazebo voluntarily before the county stepped in. And according to standard procedure, once forced removal crews get involved, the property owner can end up paying every associated cost. Equipment, labor, disposal fees, all of it. Suddenly his little couple feet doesn't matter philosophy became financially measurable. For the next 2 days the atmosphere around our properties turned ice cold. His wife stopped making eye contact entirely. Derek stomped around outside pretending to do yard work, while very obviously hoping I'd come over and negotiate. I never did, because there was nothing left to negotiate. That ship sailed the second he decided my property line was optional. Then came demolition day. Saturday morning, around 8:30, a flatbed truck backed slowly into their driveway, followed by 2 workers carrying tool belts and pry bars. No dramatic music, no screaming match, just the quiet sound of consequences arriving on schedule. I made coffee and sat out on my back porch where I had a perfect view of the whole operation. The roof came off first. They stripped the shingles and lifted the panels down piece by piece, while Derek stood nearby with his arms crossed looking like a man attending his own funeral. Then came the support beams. Once those were removed, the entire structure lost its shape almost instantly. Funny how fast something collapses when the foundation underneath it was never legitimate to begin with. By noon the railings were gone. By mid-afternoon the raised platform had been ripped apart board by board and stacked onto the trailer. And the entire time, planes kept passing overhead exactly like always, descending low across the open field toward the runway. Honestly, that part felt weirdly poetic. The airstrip had been there decades before either of us moved in, and now it was basically reclaiming the space that regulations had protected all along. Around sunset, the workers loaded the final debris onto the truck and drove away. The grass underneath the gazebo was flattened into this pale rectangular scar across the field, like the land itself still remembered the stupidity that had been sitting on top of it all week. Derek didn't say a word to me after that. Not that evening, not the next week, not ever again. Which honestly was fine by me. Because contrary to what people assume, this was never about winning. I didn't enjoy costing somebody thousands of dollars. I didn't wake up excited to involve federal aviation authorities in neighborhood drama. But there's a difference between compromise and surrender. If somebody tests your boundaries and discovers there are none, they rarely stop at one violation. Today the field behind my house looks exactly like it did before all this started. Open grass, low approach clearance, small planes drifting overhead every now and then on final descent. Quiet, orderly, safe. And every single time I hear an engine approaching low across that runway, I glance out toward that empty patch of land and think the same thing. Amazing how much trouble could have been avoided if one man had simply respected a property line painted clearly on a survey map from the very beginning. Looking back now, the craziest part of this whole thing isn't even the gazebo. It's how casually people convince themselves that rules stop applying the second something feels emotionally justified. Derek genuinely believed he was improving the space. In his head, he wasn't trespassing. He was making use of empty land. And honestly, that mindset causes way more neighborhood wars in America than people realize. Property disputes usually don't start with evil masterminds rubbing their hands together like cartoon villains. They start with tiny acts of entitlement that slowly snowball because nobody pushes back early enough. Somebody parks partially across a driveway. Then suddenly they're doing it every week. Somebody lets their fence drift 2 feet past the survey line, then acts shocked when lawyers get involved 5 years later. The lesson here is that boundaries only matter if they're enforced consistently. And that applies to way more than property lines. It applies to relationships, workplaces, friendships, all of it. The second people sense hesitation, a lot of them start testing how much they can get away with. That's just human nature. But there's another layer to this story too, and honestly, it's something I think modern neighborhoods struggle with constantly. A lot of people move into places without respecting the history that already exists there. That airstrip wasn't some new inconvenience. It had been operating long before either of us bought homes nearby. The FAA rules weren't hidden. The surveys weren't confusing. But some people arrive somewhere and immediately start mentally redesigning the environment around their personal preferences. This is a psychological trap because it creates resentment toward reality itself. Instead of adapting to the place they chose to live, they expect the place to adapt to them. And eventually that mindset collides with laws, regulations, or neighbors who refuse to bend. From a legal perspective, Derek actually got lucky. If that structure had remained there long enough and caused issues during a low approach, the liability nightmare could have been catastrophic. We're talking lawsuits, insurance claims, potentially federal penalties, all over a gazebo built for sunset wine nights and airplane watching, which is honestly kind of absurd when you think about it. But that's the thing about preventable mistakes. They always look ridiculous in hindsight. So now I'm curious, if you were in my position, would you have handled it differently? Would you have tried harder to settle things privately first, or made the same call I did the second your neighbor dismissed the property line like it didn't matter? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy these real-world neighborhood conflict stories where law, psychology, and human ego all collide in the weirdest ways imaginable, stick around, because trust me, this kind of stuff happens way more often than people think.